Welcome everyone. If you're joining us, we'll get started in just a moment here. We'll let a few more people join us. In the meantime, please drop in the chat where you're calling in from today, where you're located. And also, as we go on, we can take any questions as well along the way. But yeah, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from today, and we'll get started in just a moment. Hey, well, we can go ahead and get started. It's nice to see lots of familiar names in the chat. I always think I shouldn't call anybody out individually, but Heather Pena from University of Cincinnati, one of my former bosses, is with us. So very excited to have you here, Heather, along with everybody else. And I'm here today with my now boss, Josh Birkholz, our CEO at BWF. We're really looking forward to this conversation today. In defense of the everyday donor, we're going to be talking about lots of things related to base level giving and beyond, but really about the people who really, I would say, fuel our organizations, fuel those nonprofits and educational healthcare institutions that make us who we are and really are core to our mission. A couple of just little housekeeping things as we get started. If you have questions, please use the Q&A feature in the chat. We'll probably save a lot of those until the end, but if some come up along the way, we may try to respond to those as we go. And certainly if you want us to clarify a point we're making, we'll try to catch that and chime in with that as quickly as possible. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recording within about 24 to 48 hours. So we'll get that to you as soon as possible. I'll introduce myself, seeing as I'm speaking, and then I'll hand over to Josh. But James Barnard, I'm a managing vice president at BWF. So I lead our annual giving and digital marketing team. I work with all kinds of clients across higher education, healthcare, and the national nonprofit sector, really to help build and strengthen their base of donors using traditional and modern strategies to do exactly what we're here to talk about today, kind of engage with the everyday donor and make sure that we have a really strong foundation for the future to create those kind of long-term sustainable relationships with donors. And Josh, our CEO, is with us.
Yeah, so glad to see all of you, and thanks, James, for letting me join with you, the real expert in this space. Josh Birkholz. I actually just finished 20 years at BWF in September. I'm very proud of that run, but also more excited about just the changes I've seen. I'm from a background in data science that moved more into the campaign, and now really understanding the whole ecosystem of fundraising. I've been proud to be on the chair of the board of Giving USA for several years and being on the steering committee of the Generosity Commission, first commission of its type since 1975 to really look at this question on philanthropy in the United States, and really helped open my eyes at the full picture of giving, which I'm hoping that we present today in a way that stimulates some conversation. But most importantly, I'm just really excited to see all of you. Thank you for what you do for the sector. We exist to help make you better and to be accelerators and partners along that journey. So thanks for sharing some time with us.
Yeah. So while we're here today, Josh published a web story not too long ago. You may have seen that, where there's a variety of white papers that we've written as a company over the last few months that all kind of lead to this idea of building a better donor experience and really supporting the idea of the everyday donor. So I shared this quote on the screen. I won't read it out. I know everyone is capable of reading it themselves, but I think this in many ways captures exactly the thing that we're here to talk about, that these programs are critical to who we are as organizations and the future that we can have and that we can build together. And I would say that in many ways, I feel that we have failed our everyday donors in certain ways. We have failed to engage them in meaningful ways. We are seeing some declines in participation, and we're gonna get into that in more detail. But we think that these donors are worth our support and worth going after. And while raising more money every year is obviously critical to our missions as well, we feel there's real value in attracting more and more donors to support our cause as well. So that's kind of setting up the conversation for today. We're going to talk about where we are as an industry. That kind of Josh is going to give us that sort of 50,000-foot view of the perspective of the current landscape. We're going to talk a little bit about where we think we've gone wrong, and perhaps most importantly, where we can go from here. I think you'll find a mix of some big picture ideas, some big heavy strategies, and some more tactical things as well. And I was with a client yesterday and shared some similar ideas. And I would say the same thing that I said to the client is some of the ideas we're going to talk about are big things that are not easy to do. They're very easy for Josh and I to come here and say, well, you just easy. You need to do this, this, and this, and you'll have highly engaged donors who are ready to support the organization. We're not pretending it's simple. It's not simple. It's worthy of the hard effort and the hard work it's going to take to make this happen. So you have our full support for that.
And just a high level, thank you for joining us, educational session, but since some of you might be unfamiliar, just high level who BWF is. We're a comprehensive professional services company in the fundraising space, from campaigns and fundraising to technology to building amazing donor experiences and engaging the base of support. And we've been proud of our run, from global and local around the world, as you'll see coming up, but most data rigorous, which I like to say is it's not that we're data driven, although a lot of us are really driven to find data. I like to say sometimes what data rigorous means is we try to have basis. We're not going to come with just opinions, but we're going to have multiple perspectives and backing to the ideas we have. And we've tried really hard because we think for big questions, they warrant big research and big analysis. We've been very proud of innovating things, from creating the field of prospect research to embedding analytics within this profession to starting the first day of giving in collaboration with Florida State back when. We've enjoyed our history of innovation, and more so, we're not just all jack of all trades. We've tried really hard to find the best people in each area of specialization, the best people in annual giving and prospect development, technology, because we know that one consultant can't cover all, but we want to have the best thinkers really propelling this industry forward. And you can see it by the next slide that we're around the world, predominantly in North America, Europe, some work in Australia, one active client in Ghana right now, so we get the little red in Africa, about 275 clients annually, again, about 40 years. So we've done about 350 campaigns. We work with a team of over 100 people now, which has been a rapid change. We've grown more than doubled in the last 4 years. We've more than doubled. So we're really proud of our momentum and the impact. But we want to get to the topic at hand. So let's we can move ahead.
Yeah, a couple quick things that the services kind of related to some of the topics we're going to talk about today. Full donor experience assessments, building that roadmap to help you as an organization figure out where you need to be going to do the things that you want to accomplish. Multi or omni-channel fundraising campaigns. We have a growing base of clients where we're managing those services for them, and video ambassador teams, which is a critical piece of what we're talking about with how we engage our constituents through more and more content as a meaningful way to engage them. So we'll leave it at that, and I'll hand over to you, Josh, to get us started in earnest.
Absolutely. So probably the thing everyone talks about is how the world we're living in keeps changing. And it certainly is that. And you just rattle them off. I can put them here, the Jenga from the Tax Cuts and Job Act. That had some shift on the mid-level back in 2017. Obviously, COVID-19, where we saw some move from international to more local giving and some shifts towards human services growing. The racial justice movement really showing a renewed emphasis in certain designations. Kind of sticking with the foundation sector, individuals sort of reverting to pre-2020 giving interests for the most part. Elections that were obviously fresh in our mind, the impact, and we've seen voting begets pro-social behavior. People that vote are more likely to give, more likely to volunteer, just like people who serve on a jury are more likely to vote. But we do see some connection between giving and elections, but we also see the reactionary giving after elections towards topics that represent the counter to the winning candidates often get a little bit of boost in post-election giving. Conflicts have certainly been a big part that actually pulled our giving back internationally from the local focus in COVID-19, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and other natural disasters as well. And then donor declines, which we're here to talk about. But probably the one everyone talks about the most is inflation and that's impact when the everyday person's trying to decide can they afford gas or milk or eggs, or can they give $100 to their annual fund. It's a harder choice to make than it used to be when it costs so much more. So the times are changing. So we're certainly facing economic headwinds, and there's inflation, certainly, and inflation has really moderated, but the perceptions, it didn't go back down. So everything costs more. There was the 25 to 30% increase of costs of goods across the board. And even though that's flattened, and by many markers, the economy is actually quite good. Unemployment's low, the markets are up. There's a lot of factors, even discretionary income, what we saw in the Giving USA data, that all led to higher giving. But it's the inflation and perceptions of inflation mean there's still uncertainty and caution. Now, if we move to the next slide, what we've seen as a count of this is this kind of broader trend of the everyday donor disappearing. It's not new. All of us on this call have seen it. We've seen annual funds declining. We've seen everyday giving declining. The fundraising effectiveness project from AFP has counted every quarter that you see the numbers going down and another number of people. And it's not been per capita. It's been the total count has been going down. Fewer and fewer people give every year. Now, many have countered, and accurately so, that there has been a growth in giving outside of registered charities, giving to GoFundMe or doing other generous behaviors like generous tips, taking care of people individually, friends and family. And perhaps the definitions of generosity are changing. So maybe generosity is not declining, but we've seen a noticeable base level giving to registered charities has gone down, which includes the sectors that all of us are here from: higher education, healthcare, the arts. We're seeing those declines. The everyday donor is disappearing. Now, if you look on the next slide, um, what this brings up though is it's not just a risk in our unrestricted revenue, which we see, and engagement and ambassadorship, but these are our future major and planned gifts. A lot of our programs, certainly there has been a rise in entrepreneurial major and principal type gifts that came out of nowhere for seemingly out of interest. But still, more than half of the major gifts for many institutions. In fact, we had one institution that 90% of their major gifts to their campaign were people that had given annual fund gifts as their first entry point into the organization. We're reaping the benefits of annual gift work that happened before. Preaching to the choir, I get that. I have to tell you, I'm a preacher's kid and I have a master's in choral conducting, so I'm exceptional at preaching to the choir. But this is a real risk to future major gifts, certainly planned gifts that are often, from a mind frame perspective, based in income-based giving. When we look at major and principal gifts, those are gifts out of appreciated assets. Annual giving typically is income-based. What can I afford? It's related to my employment levels and certain roles. That's why there's a little bit more of a tax seasonality with annual giving. Well, planned gifts, even though they're manifest through assets, had their history, and their mind share is often still thinking about my income. What can I afford to give, and so forth. We can move on to the next slide. Because one of the contributing factors outside of the economy is just trust. Fewer people trust nonprofits. In the Edelman survey in 2023, 52% of Americans said that they trust nonprofits, and this was a 4% decline from the year before. And it's in close company with the government and news media. Those are the only two it's ahead of, and it's actually fallen behind big business. So more people trust big business than they do nonprofits. Now, there's some counter statistics to that. It might be pushing in the 60s for active donors, which we saw in a Dunham study that was sponsored by Giving USA at the beginning of 2023. So an existing donor has a higher trust than the everyday person, but the everyday person, 52% of them trust nonprofits. Now, they would also say that if it's in my backyard, the charity I know, I have more trust in them. So it's the generic nonprofit that there's 52% trust. The one that I know that I see, there's about a 70% level of trust. So it's the nonprofit as a sector that the trust is down for. We can move ahead to the next slide. Because despite all this inflation, these declining counts, we keep seeing the giving dollars going up. I mean, in current dollars, they're going up. Now, 2021 was a record year. It was way high. And we're down from an inflation adjustment, even though those current dollars are up. We saw the Giving Tuesday last year. It raised the same amount of money, but from 10% fewer people. We keep seeing this number go up, even though the number of people goes down. 557 billion. So over $500 billion industry. It's more than 2% of the GDP in the United States. And this number starts over at zero every year. This isn't like a stock price where this is the value of the sector. This was 557 billion in new gifts that were given in that year. And what's driving this, as you'll see on the next slide, is predominantly the asset markets. Like a lot of people say with GDP, that it tracks with GDP. And correlatively, yeah, it's been about 2% of the GDP as a kind of a benchmark of what giving is. But we've seen more and more times where GDP goes up and giving goes down, or GDP goes down and giving goes up, where it is tracking closer to the asset markets. Because as more and more giving comes from high wealth people, it's more likely those gifts are coming from appreciated assets. And so where the assets are going up and down, and it's not just stocks, which is one of the easiest ones to measure, but real estate, business interests, broader private company, and so forth. Those business assets are actually driving giving more so, but it's driving giving at the top. And we see that, and a lot of our organizations are adapting to that. So the nonprofits, I'd say, are doing actually quite well. They're investing in principal giving. They're investing in lead generation. They're applying donor AI to identify prospects. They're building out scaled prospect management systems for major giving, and we're providing career paths and excellent opportunities for those in major giving, and in many ways focusing our programs on major giving. Even firms like ours and like our sector, like we could come in and help with a campaign, and as long as those top 50 donors give, that campaign was great. But if the alumni participation went down, what does that hurt us? So even the whole ecosystem has this sort of a bias towards the major giving, towards the relational fundraising. And we've seen some great things. This is a wonderful thing. In fact, we encourage you to invest in these things because it is financially the smart thing to do. Building the understanding of structured philanthropy, complex asset conversion, when there's an opportunity for a designated opportunity that we can advise in the gift construction. And then we give what I say in my third bullet, impact-based messaging, that really resonates with the high net worth. But as a contrast, as you'll see on the next slide, we're not seeming to sector-wide, even though some of you might be, we're not as a sector adapting as well to the disappearing base. We're seeing underinvestment in the annual fund. While we see someone going to campaign hiring, a dozen more major gift officers, and it's the same size annual fund that they had before. And so what we're not seeing is the organizational infrastructure that can support ecosystem type fundraising, that investment happening, because we can measure the return on that high net worth donor, and we get it. But we're not doing a good job of explaining the long game of where those major donors came from. Like the example that one client that 90% of these gifts came from work that this ecosystem, that this annual fund had done for years before that point. And even in our messaging, we do know that the high net worth response to impact messaging, I give so that this thing can happen, an instrumentality message. We give so that we can solve this big problem. Perhaps I even get credit for solving that problem. There's a little bit of credit or co-creation feel to the major donor. If you're given $100, $1,000, $5,000, you might not feel that next to that multi-million-dollar donor, but you do still respond to intrinsic value and community message. Meaning this is what people like us do. Giving it's better to give than to receive. Giving feels good is sort of intrinsic value, which is something that's kind of disappeared a little bit in the fundraising space. And then community messaging. While my gift might have impact, I do see the impact of my community. Our group of people, we're the ones choosing to change the world. And I feel that impact through this association and identity with the larger group of people. So we're not adapting. And so what went wrong? I'm going to turn it over to James to give some of his thoughts.
Yeah, so where did all the donors go? That's the question that I often am asking and discussing with clients. And a lot of this is summarizing the points Josh has made. A couple of additional things that I would point to. My third bullet on the left-hand side, increased competition for mind share. It's just, we live in a world full of distractions. Every place you go, everywhere you look, there's a million things to distract your attention away from something. And so it's harder and harder to engage people in any sort of meaningful way, harder to get them to take that action. Whereas something I'll talk about a little later on is the ability of the annual giving program in a typical American higher education institution, was built on the idea of calling people during dinner time, interrupting them at their dinner table and getting their attention. spending a couple minutes on the phone with them, and you could, have a pretty good likelihood of securing that gift. And in many ways, we've lost that ability. We're not able to get people's attention that much anymore. We see things like in email marketing. I think the average amount of time somebody spends reading an email is less than 8 seconds, if they even open it at all. And only, maybe 30% of people are actually opening that email. And of the people who do, they're spending no more than 8 seconds reading it. So it's very harder than ever to get people's attention and to keep that mind share. Josh talked about the declining in trust in institutions, got some ideas around how to combat that. And the pressure around the fundraising targets. The other thing I would say, if I'm really sort of thinking critically about the work that has happened over the past decade or so, I think we failed to offer a really compelling case for support for the everyday donor, for the annual fund, or for your sort of, whatever it is that you're asking base level donors to give to. I think that's partly like how we talk about the impact of base level gifts. I think partly it's like how we talk about the collective impact. Often we don't talk about that. We're trying to show like, a $50 gift can do X, Y, Z, and that becomes increasingly difficult to do, especially at larger organizations. It's a little bit easier for some nonprofits to be able to do that, but large institutions, that's a very difficult thing to do. We don't talk enough about the collective impact and that sense of community and what everyday donors are contributing together and how they are making an impact together. We're not doing a good enough job with that. Also, when we communicate, we often wait until after the gift is made to talk about impact, which sort of sounds intuitive. It sounds obvious, like, well, when somebody makes a gift, we'll tell them the impact they made. But we need to actually be doing that before the gift. We need to be showing them what it feels like to be a donor, showing what impact they can make when we're making that ask, and before we even make that ask, so that we can have their attention long enough to get in front of them with the right ask. We need to be telling them about impact in more meaningful ways early on. And then it's also just a frequency and consistency thing. There's a lot of reasons why this is the case, resources being one of them. We've got limited time, we have limited budgets, but because of the competition for the mindshare, we need to be talking about this stuff much, much more. We need to be hyper relevant. We need to be hyper targeting in who we're talking to. But we need to be more consistent about talking about the impact of philanthropy, about the intrinsic value of being a donor, and what it can mean to support an organization. So that's why we sort of endorse what we call the engagement first approach, which is in many ways just a philosophy that I talk about with clients all the time. Around how we should think about engaging everyday donors. We typically have spent a lot of time. I often use the annual giving terminology. That's kind of the background I come from. But in those base level giving programs, we are really good at asking for money. What I would say is the middle of the fundraising funnel, the part where we're sort of making that solicitation, and we do a lot of testing around that and figure out, will the pink BRE have a better return than the yellow BRE, and trying to come up with the science behind it. And that's all good stuff. We need to spend more time at the top of the funnel. This is where we're raising awareness for philanthropic need, and we're talking to people about basically why we're talking to them, right? Where we're helping them to find meaningful ways to connect with those donors. Doing that before we swoop in and ask for money, that's going to help us. And in certain parts of the fundraising sector, higher education in particular, we've had this sort of emphasis on engagement, but is it necessarily connected to the philanthropic piece? And are we talking about that in a way that actually makes sense for people, where they can connect the dots on their philanthropic journey? Sometimes what this means is, in an engagement first approach, is foregoing the short-term ROI in favor of something bigger in the long run. This is really hard to do, partly because tenure in positions is sometimes feels like it's getting shorter and shorter. At the sort of chief development officer level, it's getting shorter. At director of annual giving level, it can be getting shorter as well. But there's always pressure to hit a fundraising target by December 31st or June 30th, whatever your fiscal year is. We need to be thinking more about long-term plans and how we're building a community of active, engaged supporters over time. And that may mean that some of these strategies mean we may raise less money in the short term, and we have to spend money in order to be able to build up these strategies, but they'll have a better payoff in the long run. There was a white paper that we published not too long ago. We already presented a webinar on this, so I won't go into it in a huge amount of detail, but really quantifying the value of those base level donors that started their giving journey with a gift under $1,000, who went on to make a gift of $25,000 or more in their lifetimes. And it took them, this was in a higher ed study, it took them about 26 years of giving, but their combined value per institution was $450 million. So you can see that that value is absolutely there. The ROI is there, but we have to be thinking longer term about when that return should actually come. And then the final piece of this is acknowledging and responding to the fact that there are many different forms of engagement. And I think every time I present on this topic, I have a slightly different angle on this because I'm constantly changing the way I'm thinking about it. What it comes down to is there's not just one way that a donor will engage with an organization. Like there's people that love going to events. There's people that love to read a magazine. There's people who spend a lot of time on social media. And there's a lot of people who do multiples of these things. We have to acknowledge that people do it in different ways, and it's also not a linear journey. We have to cede some of the control where we love to be able to control everything that we can and say like, okay, we're going to send out this mailing, and then we're going to send out this email, and then this social media post. The reality is that that's not how people are interacting with us. So we have to be a little bit more reactive in how or responsive in how we're building out our strategies. We'll get into more of these later on as well. I wanted to talk about the trust triangle. There is an excellent book that I highly recommend. Ashley Budd, who's at Cornell, she wrote a book with a colleague of hers. It's called Mailed It. It's all about email marketing. It's great if you're looking for tips on strategy and some tactical stuff around email marketing. One of the things she talks about in that book is this trust triangle. So I wanted to credit her with this, but also the original source is it's in the Harvard Business Review. It's essentially saying if you want to build trust with customers, and in our case, we're going to talk about with donors, there's really three things that you need to be looking at: authenticity, empathy, and logic. So on the authenticity side, when we think about this from a fundraising perspective, sometimes we will try to be everything to everybody. And in turn, we end up diluting our message. And this is a very challenging thing to do. But I think the best possible way to do this, the best practice, if you like, would be to stay true to our values and find the people that are our people. I was listening to, I'm going to go off topic, and this is a dangerous thing for me to do, but I was listening to a Simon Sinek audiobook yesterday. I'm sure a lot of you have read Start With Why. And he talks about in that book companies that get the feedback that they don't have an authentic brand. And so their response to that is to go out and ask customers, how can we communicate more authentically? Which he thinks is a laughable idea, because if you go out and ask people how to be authentic, you're doing the absolute opposite of that. Authenticity is something that should come naturally to you, and being true to yourself and true to your brand and who you are and what your mission is as a nonprofit organization. That's how you build that authenticity up. Then it's a question of, will people believe you, which will happen over time, depending on how you communicate. With empathy, people want to believe that you care about them and their successes. I will have to tell a quick story in this. Jen Heisey's on this in this webinar. I saw her in the chat earlier. Another one of my bosses at the University of Cincinnati. She told me that if you went to events and you met an individual at an event, like say you're at a networking event, and you went up to somebody with your hand out and said, let me tell you about myself, and then you can give me some money, the person would probably walk away from you pretty quickly. We don't do that at events when we meet people. We go out and we put our hand out to shake their hand, and we say, tell me about yourself. What are you interested in? What do you do? That's how you build relationships. Yet, as nonprofits, what we're very good at doing is telling people about ourselves. We put out all kinds of messaging about how great we are, touting our achievements. And of course, we need to talk about our outcomes and the impact we have. Of course, we have to do that. But if all we do is talk about ourselves and then put our hand out and ask for money, we're not showing that empathy. We're not showing donors that we actually care about them and want them to have a good experience. So we've got to focus more on that. And then the logic piece is very straightforward. Do they believe that we can do what we say we're going to do? So if we put out there this problem into the world and say we're going to fix it, is it logical that we could do that? So if your mission is to change the whole world, that's an admirable mission. Is it believable? Like, can you do that? Do you have the resources to do it? Is it likely that that can happen? I think if we need to think about like how we're presenting our cause and what we're telling people we're going to fix for them and what the challenges that we're going to overcome with their support, that has to be believable. And all of this leads to a shift that I think we need to make in our work. And that is shifting from being obsessed with asking to being obsessed with engaging. I think this is like such a critical point for where we're at in the fundraising world at the moment. This does not mean, and please don't take away from this, that what we need to do is ask less. It does not mean like, all right, stop sending out your fundraising appeals. We're not going to ask people for money anymore. Of course, we shouldn't do that. We need to put that amount of creativity, that amount of energy into the work we do to engage people, and then asking people who are actively engaged. And the one way to say it is like warm leads versus cold leads. People who essentially are ready for that ask, they're going to be far more likely to respond. So our asking, our appeals, and our solicitations can become much more efficient and have higher conversion rates. And our donors will start with a really good experience where they have a much better understanding of what we're about as an organization. And because they're highly engaged first before we make that ask. So kind of leads to like, what's the problem? Why don't we do this? And one of the things, I'm not saying this is the be all and end all of the issue here, but this is one of the problems I credit with this is marketing attribution. It's not, frankly, something we talk about much at all in the fundraising world. I think it should be. In the typical sort of annual giving model or base level giving model, we don't even necessarily think about what we're doing. This is just what we do. We use a version of the last touch model where essentially if a gift comes in with an appeal code, somebody sends in the little pledge card and it's got an appeal code on that, we credit that $100 gift with that appeal code. Makes a lot of sense to do that. We completely ignore the 10 appeals they got before that, or any emails they got, any events they may have attended. We tend to also override if a gift officer has an interaction. We'll override all the communication pieces they ever received and give the credit to that gift to the gift officer. That's a typical thing to see. And we have very few ways to really measure that influenced giving, the impact of all of the things that we're doing to engage people. And that's not just like in-person events. That's a lot of content, a lot of marketing stuff. We have very little way to credit that work with influencing giving down the road. And I'm not going to go into each of these models in great detail today. I'm just presenting to you the idea that there are alternative ways to do marketing attribution. There are alternative ways to think about where gifts are coming from. There's a variety of models that we can look into. All of these essentially are a way of giving credit to different touch points along the way. And I'm not for a second suggesting that you need to start splitting up a $100 gift between 5 different appeals. Like that's going to become an absolute nightmare. There's other ways I think we can do this and start to give credit. It's not really about, what appeal code you put in your CRM. We can use dashboards and BI tools to help us understand the effect of these things. The point is, we're simply not looking at the whole picture. We are using one data point to determine what was effective in that fundraising piece. And if you think about in the world outside fundraising, there's a lot of tactics that really are much more difficult to measure. Think about television advertising, for example. No one clicks on a television ad and buys a pair of sneakers, and yet we have assumed and taken for granted for decades that television advertising is successful. There are other ways to measure if that is being effective. But if we don't credit engagement and marketing efforts with that fundraising success, we will continue to divest in those strategies and we'll only put money towards the things that we can track. There's the phrase, I'll misquote this, but not everything that can be tracked has some value, but not everything of value can be tracked. I think that's kind of where we're going wrong here. This is not real data. This is made up numbers, but I promise you this looks exactly like a lot of data that I see when I look at organizations and their appeal tracking, and they show me these like, well, here's where where our revenue came from last year. And I have a lot of questions about this way of tracking things. And I get it. It's hard to track like some gifts, and a lot of places will put a whole lot of money in that other category where they just don't have the appeal code. They don't have the ability to say where that gift came from. The problem with that is that we start using this to make decisions, and we're using half-truths to make a big investment decision. So people look at this thing and they say, well, mail raised less money than online, forgetting for a second that those two are different categories. One's an inbound channel, one's an outbound channel. And then like this whole big other column right in the middle there, like all of this money must have just magically happened. I think it's perfectly acceptable that it's tricky to do the tracking work. I understand that. But if we then use that to definitively say, well, mail is declining, or that phone program doesn't work, or social media is no good at raising money, if that's our approach to things, we'll never innovate. We'll never start trying out different strategies to see which things are going to work, because if we can't track them in our world, we just don't believe that they're successful. Back to you, Josh.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? One of the things I would encourage you to, if you've not seen this, perhaps you have already, but if you go to the link at the bottom, www.thegenerositycommission.org, this is a really amazing resource. All the research that was funded, University of Maryland, Indiana, Stanford, lots of universities did some really amazing research on this question that we're talking about today. Go there, go through some of the supporting research and so forth, and the primary report, if nothing else, read that report. What I pulled out here are some of the key recommendations. And in high level, it gets into how we expand and apply the research in the space. How do we normalize talking about it? Recognizing where this type of giving is happening, how it's changing. Like one example of that is like in the upper right corner, there's the role of businesses. Historically, I mean, Giving USA back in the 50s and 60s, 2/3 pushing 3/4 of Giving the United States was to religion. And now that's about a quarter of Giving the United States. But the giving from religion, people saw when they were kids, modeled philanthropy. Weekly, they'd see their parents give. And oftentimes that was the entry point. Now what we're finding is a larger entry point to giving is the first time someone gives might be through a workplace giving program. Where people start, where they're seeing giving happening is changing. When you see buying like coloring the little chili at Chili's, a little pepper, or putting a sticker above the cash register. The concept behind that is so that kids can see their parents giving. It's not about the dollar. It's about modeling the philanthropy. So just seeing how do we have an entry point at a very young age about philanthropy is something that we do, but also broader questions of choosing to invest in this, to advocate for giving. I'm not going to go through all the details. There's some wonderful recommendations, but I do recommend taking some time to look through all that research. There's amazing stuff there that was really well done by a lot of wonderful people. And so if we go to the next slide, I think we need to have an all hands on deck. And when I say all hands on deck, this is leadership as well as staff. This is consultants like us, campaign consultants and technology providers. This is the ecosystem that are creating tool sets. We need to choose to care about this because of the long-term implications for our profession, for philanthropy, because nonprofits are essential. They solve essential problems. Our universities, our healthcare programs are solving the big problems. And they can't, and we are going to be hamstringing and we're going to be borrowing from the future generations if we're not investing here. So leaders do need to advocate for funding the base development programs, even if they can't prove to the board this is how much more money it'll make this year. We need to think about, or maybe just back on that for a little bit longer, the career paths for these professionals. How many heads of development had their start in annual giving versus major giving? It doesn't take long for someone in the annual giving space or in the base marketing or membership program to say, oh, I better learn major giving if I want to get promoted. So we have a higher level of transiency in people that are creating the innovations in the space, and a lot of people that are starting over. As James had pointed out, the level keeps getting higher for expectations, but the ability of the person is often they're often still onboarding. The analytics, we're seeing AI around identifying major gifts. I'm not seeing nearly as much. I know we're certainly working on it here, but more analytics and technology into this space and researching these pathways, these linear and nonlinear pathways, as James was talking about. So going ahead to the next slide then. And having a program-wide focus on this fundraising ecosystem. I think this is a really important thing to think about. In my past, I used to be a huge sports fan and I've worked really hard to break myself. I did a sports cleanse back in, I think it was 2019, before the pandemic. So I was glad I did it then, where I was seeing too much sports. I was watching. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take a year off. And I didn't do any. And the hardest thing was I was a 9-year season ticket holder for our NHL hockey team. That's probably my favorite sport was hockey. Maybe it's cliched as a Minnesotan here nor there. But the reason I became a season ticket holder wasn't because some season ticket rep found me through a lead generation system and said, hey, you need to buy season tickets. Absolutely. Go wild. Thanks, Nate. I agree with you. It wasn't because of the season ticket rep. I'd enjoyed the game on the field. I got to meet other people from games I went to. There was selective seat events. There was opportunities to meet players. There was the marketing that I saw, the television commercials about joining the warming house for the opportunity to get tickets when they come available. And I went through all those things. But once I became a season ticket holder, I did get assigned a season ticket rep to me that nudged me and moved me forward. She was absolutely part of the ecosystem, but it was so much more than that. And Nate, yeah, I'm not going to even say the name because I agree with you completely. Oh, those are fighting words. I'm sorry to all of you in Dallas, but I agree. Anyways, the having a program-wide focus means it's not just staffing, but what's our overall labor allocation? Not just these metrics, which 9 out of 10 you go to case conference and the metrics are just major gift officer metrics. What is the metrics more broadly and the motivation in a program? The frontline focus to a program-wide focus from just data, which we might have an operations bias. Oh, that's what the data people do, to what's basis for all of our programmatic decisions, short-term and long-term views. And from a silos to holistic journeys, how do people proceed through our organization? And I'm loving the Minnesota talk. All my Minnesotan people representing. Thank you for that. We can go on to the next slide. I'm going to sit here and think about the Minnesota Wild hockey team. Oh, good stuff.
So, there's lots of different ways to engage your prospective donors, your current donors. And a lot of that stuff is experiential. One of the things I want to talk about, though, for a little bit of our time left together is just content, the content economy. This is because I think this is one of the places we're just simply not doing enough. There's so much more we can do. There's a real untapped opportunity here. The content economy is really where a lot of people are spending a lot of their time these days, even if they don't like to admit it, they don't like to talk about it. Influencer marketing is a really big thing, and everyone sort of knows all about that. But I think it's probably bigger than people realize and driving more activity and more decision making than people care to think. And I don't think we've really even sort of tapped the surface here of what is possible when it comes to fundraising. We've been doing some peer-to-peer stuff over the last decade or so. There's ambassadors. Giving days have been a way to tap into this a little bit. I still think there's so much more we can do, though, in the content economy. And not all of that is influencers. Some of that is just creating more content and making sure we're doing really effective channel distribution for that. I want to tell you a little story to illustrate my point, and I'll try to make this quick. A few months ago, I was sitting on the couch with my wife, Sarah. It was the end of a long day. We have two very small children under 4 years old. So we, at the end of the day, sort of put them to bed. And for about 15, 20 minutes, there's just this sort of wind down happening when we're decompressing. We don't really talk to each other. Sometimes we have the TV on, but we're just sort of looking at our phones, right? We're just sort of scrolling on whatever social media app of choice. And I come across this video. I've always had this sort of interest in cruise ships, despite never having actually been on a cruise ship myself. But I was drawn to this video. It's this person, I don't know who she is, cruise ship captain, I guess, and she's doing this sort of behind the scenes tour of a cruise ship. And I was kind of interested in it, and I watched probably the whole thing, and it was about 90 seconds, which is far longer than most people stay watching a video on like social media for. And I scroll on a bit, see a few more videos, and finally another video comes up, and it's the same captain. I recognize her this time. I now come to learn her name is Captain Kate McHugh. She's the captain of the largest cruise ship in the world. I think it's a celebrity cruise ship. And I'm still watching the second video thinking, okay, this is kind of interesting. She's just like going out, creating this content on herself in her spare time. And this one's really interesting. She actually is giving a tour of the lifeboat, which I imagine cruise ship lifeboats. When I think of that, I think of the Titanic movie and the lifeboats on those. Apparently, they're way nicer these days. So that's comforting if you are going to go on a cruise. But I come to realize, like, okay, she's just giving this backstage tour. Anyway, carry on, go about my day. And I think a couple of days later, I'm scrolling and I get another video. And at this point, I'm captured. They got my attention, and I go and follow her, and I go on the deep dive, and I learn all about it. And I realize, of course, they are trying to recruit me to go work on the cruise ship, which I think is great. So I'm like ready to pack my bags, and I'm mentally halfway to the airport when I remember I have a job I love. I have a wife and kids that I love, and I should probably not go work for 9 months on a cruise ship, and come to the realization that actually they probably just want to sell me a cruise. You finally realize this is not just a captain of a cruise ship in her spare time, because I'm sure you have tons of spare time when you're driving a ship, creating video content because she likes it. This is an intentional marketing strategy by Celebrity Cruise Lines. She's supported by a digital team who are helping capture this content, helping edit it together. It's super simple. It's extremely authentic in nature. And it's more than anything else, it's just compelling. It makes you get the experience of what it feels like to go on a cruise. And for somebody that's like kind of interested in a cruise and yet has never gone on one, I was gripped by this stuff. I think I watched every single video that she made over 90 days. And that's a lot of content. So it kind of made me realize this is actually very similar to some of the work that we've been doing, like with our client at George Washington University, where we do high volume video work with students, and we're using students who are really their best student storytellers, and we're creating these authentic videos at a high volume. We're talking hundreds of videos in a year, and just capturing the experience of being at GW, what it's like to be a student there, and it helps people get that feeling and bring back some memories if they're alumni. Highly effective, sometimes difficult to track the impact, but we're seeing in their overall gains year over year increases in their alumni, in their donor participation counts. We're seeing that it's really, really being effective. You know, I mentioned earlier that we used to be able to like call people during dinner time and interrupt them, and we've lost that ability. Well, that may be true, but at the same time, we have, I would say, no limits in our ability to connect with people. You know, people are using their phones all day long. I'm sure you've all been on Zoom calls with people and you start realizing, like, I don't think they're paying attention anymore. I think they're on their phone, texting or on social media. Perhaps you're, you know, I do this. It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm watching a TV show that is actually enjoyable and I'm engaged in the TV show. And then I realize all of a sudden I'm looking at my phone. I don't know why I do that. I don't know why I have to do it. And the one that I'll never admit to is, you know, we're looking after our kids, and before you realize it, the kids disappeared, and you're like on a deep dive on social media somewhere. People are using their phones all day long, and it's not just phones. There's other ways things people are doing as well. But our ability to connect with people, if we can find them in the right places, is absolutely limitless. So the question then becomes, what are we going to do with this opportunity? This is where I get into life cycle marketing, and I mentioned this earlier about the funnel, and this is what I'm talking about. Like, more work is needed at the top of the funnel to engage that audience, to build that awareness of philanthropic need. And we cannot, even in the higher ed world where we assume our alumni know who we are, that's not the same thing. We're talking about awareness of philanthropic need and thinking about us day in, day out. That is true across all the fundraising sectors. And then we need to do a better job at the bottom. So lifecycle marketing is all about touching people at every step of their journey, right? So we're, again, very good at the middle part where we ask them for money, what I've called the sort of engagement phase, the solicitation phase. We need to do a better job at the beginning and the end. And when we talk about at the bottom of the funnel, the loyalty piece, we have a very short amount of time, I think, where the main thing we get when somebody makes a donation to a nonprofit they care about, they feel really, really good. It's a feeling. That's like the most important piece. And that obviously wanes over time. And I think it wanes pretty quickly. We have a very limited window of opportunity to engage in that donor and really make them feel, wow, it feels good to be a donor to this organization. This is something I will do again. This is something maybe I'll consider setting up a monthly donation for, so I get this feeling every single month. We often will leave those people alone. We'll send them one automated gift receipt by mail or email, and then we think, well, better not touch them for 11 months until it's time to renew their gift. That's absolutely the wrong way to do it. I'm not saying go out there next week and ask for another gift. I'm saying, like, don't miss your opportunity to engage and connect with people who have just raised their hand and said, I'm interested in this cause. I want to be part of it. I want to join you. Those are the people we need to spend a lot of time and energy engaging. And then we have to remember, and I think this is our final content slide, the journey is simply not linear. And again, I think it's, and I know this from my nearly 2 decades of doing annual giving work, is that we love to be able to control everything and have like a cadence where we say, okay, the mailer's going to go out and the emails and all these different touch points. It simply isn't how people live. The one thing you have to remember in this, when we talk about the donor's journey, it is not our journey. It is their journey. They are in control of it. They're going to go to these channels and these places in any way they want to do. They may get a email from you, and they're not going to click on the link. They're going to go not to your website. They're going to go to Google and type in give to whatever, you know, institution, whatever nonprofit it is. Then they're going to get that search result, click on that, and that's when they're going to make their gift. So the tracking is a little bit, you know, tricky. It throws us off very often. We have to get comfortable with the idea that not everything is trackable, and that the journey is going to happen in a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, and the ways that they want to engage with us are always going to be a little bit different. We cannot possibly expect to be utilizing every single channel in the most effective way possible. Very few nonprofit organizations have the budget to support that. We got to try to figure out where our people are, find that ideal donor, those most likely donors, and then engage them where we think they're hanging out. So at this point, we happily take some questions. I'll check the Q&A, and if there's any other questions, it looks like we have a. Oh, the first one is, can you talk more about the nonlinear journey? So I think we probably just did that. But essentially, yeah, that's the idea that it's not this sort of single cadence of touch points. If you send out 10 emails to somebody and you think, okay, so the emails are going to build on content every single time, we're going to tell one story over 10 installments. Most people are going to read, like, open 2 to 3 of those emails statistically, and they're going to spend a very, very short amount of time reading any of those emails. So that's kind of what we're getting at. Like, you just can't predict precisely how people are going to engage. So you need to think about that in how you do your storytelling. And the other question, do you have an average median age for first-time donor at the annual giving level? I don't have that, and I would say it absolutely would differ by sector. I don't know that I have a sector-wide number. It's a very interesting stat to look at, and something we would look at with what's oh, sorry, I was distracted by another question. It's something that we would like to look at like individual client level, is trying to understand when are those donors joining. And for some organizations, it's like, especially some nonprofits, that's likely to be from, later stage in life. I'd say in higher ed, that's probably younger is typical. If you're not getting gifts from people in their first sort of 20 years, you're less likely to get gifts later on. That's not necessarily universal across all institutions. Okay.
Right. And there's also a lot of comments and questions in the chat. Keep them coming. I love Vicky's statement that people don't give to organizations, they give through them. And I think about that a lot recently too, as we've been studying different donor behaviors. When you give to a charity, you're saying something about who you are and your identity. I care about this cause, what it represents. There's certainly the feeling. There's that aspect of it as well, and how valuable that is. Also relating a little bit to some of the society work and other things, how much people want to join a community of people doing that gift. I mentioned early on that they might not see impact individually, but they'll see impact through the community. And what we've seen in some of our data is we've simply looked at if a donor is friends with another donor, and we've seen lifetime giving go up by 3-4 times with some of our clients in client-specific studies, just from being friends. So how vital that is. We focus on cultivating the relationship between us and the constituent to our charity, but actually just spending as much time cultivating them with each other will have returns to the program. And that's recognizing that you're a part of their journey, their life story. I love that. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah. There's a question about like examples of pre-impact stewardship work. I won't give like a specific organizational example, but a more generic example is, I think something I love is we don't do a lot of we tend to do like donor profiles, but I would reframe those and think about donors telling other donors like their story, not just like why they give, because that's something that might be deeply personal. But if we can get donors to talk about what it feels like to be a donor and what that sense of community is, I think that at the base level is going to become more useful to us. Because again, that stuff, they're often telling stories about a very large gift, $100,000, $1 million gift. And again, deeply personal, very specific about in nature. And sometimes for your everyday donor, that may not be what they relate to. Yet if we can get more sort of, what are our loyal donors who give every year? It's not a huge amount necessarily, but they're pretty loyal about it. Can we get them to tell their story of why they give and think about how we deliver that message? If you can do a quick photo shoot with somebody, can you also capture 30 seconds of video of them telling that story? 15 seconds even is probably enough. And then you can print the story in your magazine, you can put it in an email, and you can use video on social media as well. You've in a sort of 10-minute conversation with a donor, you're able to capture content that you can use across 3 different channels. So we have to be as efficient as possible in how we distribute that content.
I love that. I might comment a little bit, somewhat related to Stephen and Adam's questions in the Q&A too, really about sort of that engagement piece there. I have to admit, I'm a cliched fan of Seth Godin. I love Seth Godin, and one of my favorite books of his was This Is Marketing, which he originally was going to call People Like Us Do Things Like This, which I actually love that as a title. and how important that is in marketing and also in annual giving. Because there's some aspect as you're building a community, you're creating norms within this group. This is what people like us do. And in some ways, as you're establishing those norms, you can kind of create, and I don't mean this from a manipulation perspective, but almost a sense of FOMO. Like for me to fit in this group is being engaged as a donor. That's one of the behaviors. Partly why we see that if multiple people give to the same place and that's how they became friends, they're less likely to stop giving because my friendship, that's a connective tissue to our friendship. So I think often about establishing that community using identity type messaging. Charity Water is one that comes to mind. They don't ask you to give to Charity Water as much as they say, join this group of people changing the world. And then the giving is a behavior through that engagement, but it's more about joining the group of donors. It's a subtle distinction, but I love that because it does seem to work quite well for those organizations that can do that. I know I saw one question here specific about the lifetime engagement from the paper. And maybe James, if you remember that number off the top of your head, what's the average lifetime giving of those that start as annual giving donors and become major donors over time?
I don't. I will misquote it if I do it. But
Okay,
we
I
can
couldn't
send out a
remember
link to
either.
that. I tell you what we can do is when we send out the recording, we can put a link to the white paper. It's not small. I know that. I apologize for not being able to remember that on the spot. We're pretty much at time. I know there's a poll we're going to put up. If you're interested in learning more about any specific areas of service, we're happy to chat more about those things. Try to answer, add one more comment to Josh's point about charity water. It's in many ways a version of sort of lifestyle marketing, and another brand that's not charitable, not or not exactly. Patagonia is really good at this. They, if you go to their website, very little emphasis on trying to sell you coats or outdoor gear. There's actually a lot of content about activism, a lot of content about like the who it is to be a Patagonia customer is more like what it is and what it feels like. So a good example of how they're essentially using content to engage you, and then there's no doubt that they're selling a lot of gear as well, but it's almost like it's secondary to who they are when they're talking about themselves. Well, we really appreciate you all spending a little bit of your day with us. I know it's a busy time of year and everyone has a lot of things going on, so we're thrilled that you took the time to chat with us today. Save the date, or you can scan the QR code there for our next BWF webinar. Is Donor AI worth it in driving your healthcare philanthropy team's success? That is presented by Josh Laborde and Jan Wood, two of our very fantastic colleagues. So I hope you'll join us for that. And otherwise, all there is left to say is thank you, Josh, for the conversation today.
And thank you, James. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for doing what you do. Like we're on the front lines. We believe the everyday donor can resurge, and this is going to be the spark. We're gonna make this happen. So I believe in all of you. Thanks for being part of our afternoon today.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll see y'all.